Hello and welcome back to Ride Rescue. Well, I've eaten a huge helping of humble pie over this one. After bringing it back to the garage twice now, once on a tow truck, pretty embarrassing. Call myself a car guy. I get the feeling that the car is getting way too much fuel. It's flooding out, it's fouling the plugs. Who knows why? There's a number of things it could be. I thought I had everything set right. So I got to go back and go completely through everything. I got to check my floats and the carburetors. I got to check the needle and seat. I've got to check the screens in here to make sure I'm not picking up anything in the old fuel system. I know the tank was clean, but all the old fuel lines, I blew them out, but you never know what could have been lingering in there. It's got a good filter in it, but once you get past the filter, those are old lines too. So I gotta check everything and really look this over. So I'm trying to diagnose why does it run so well when it comes to the warmer temperatures and then so terrible when it comes to the cold. This carburetor was set up, the center carburetor, linkage was set up this way when I got it, when it was just sitting under his bench. And I added this mechanical linkage. This carburetor setup originally had vacuum. It had a vacuum port here, and then it had another vacuum setup here with some bracketry that was pushed off of these cams. Some of the pieces were missing, some of the pieces were no longer working correctly. A lot of guys just converted these over to mechanical linkage. So that's what I did. Now, doing more and more research, I'm seeing that this cam is not set up correctly, so that when this is wide open throttle, it's not even close to wide open throttle. These cams, the linkage, this is pulling too far down. So the only way to get it all the way down, this is full throttle with the pedal. Now you can see the movement. That is some big movement right there. There's no way for that pedal to pull it that far. So this, I hadn't noticed, and I wish I would have paid a little bit more attention. This pivot pin right here is too high and too far forward of the actual pivot point. So I wanted to use this as a reference when it comes to the linkage of this two barrel. So there's definitely got to be some similarities, and one of the things I'm noticing is the pivot point for the transmission kickdown and the throttle pin. They are right across from each other. Now I'm looking at newer models, say the 65, 66 GTOs, and there is a bracket that actually comes up in this area that gives a better pivot point. So one of the things that I'm noticing as I'm moving this linkage, when this is all the way wide open, fully pivoting and hitting the stop, that should be hitting that stop right there at the base of the carburetor. And this linkage should have more travel before it hits that stop right there and starts to push the other carburetors open, the other two. So that's an issue also. And now as I keep moving this throttle and keep running it more and more, you see there's starting to become a puddle. So something is leaking that I hadn't noticed either. But as I move around the car, I'm not noticing any other leaks. But there's some wetness around that carburetor. And what's interesting is the gasket between the throttle body base and the throttle body itself. There is a slight vent hole right there on both sides. And when I take this carburetor apart, you'll be able to see it. It does have a slight air slot, and I looked at it in the instruction manual for rebuilding these carburetors, and both of these have that. And if I look really close, you see a little bit of seepage around this carburetor too. Well, that makes sense. When the car is running, it's got enough vacuum that it's going to actually suck that air in. But a lot of vacuum is going to cause issues with these front and rear carburetors. So that's something that I really need to address as well. But I suspect that's what a lot of this problem is these pivot points are just not accurate. I'm not getting enough travel with the carburetor, and when the choke is closed in these extreme colds, because it seems to only be a problem in the cold. It runs absolutely fantastic when it's warm. So when this choke closes a little bit and it's pulling more fuel in, that's when the car is just flooding out. So it's definitely carburation. Now that I'm seeing that puddling, there's some issues here that I really need to investigate. So I am going to just order a whole new kit. They have a piece that bolts on here that looks like it'll correct the way this all cams and the lengths and the way the throttle linkage is. And then I'm going to go ahead and tear this carburetor apart, take it apart again, and just really scrutinize everything about it. Make sure I don't see any extra wear on any places, or whether the butterflies are seated properly, and any other little pieces that just might have, and maybe collected a little bit of grit, maybe something washed up from the fuel system. After all, the car had been parked for 40 years. I completely cleaned out and flushed out the gas tank, so I know the gas tank is spotless. But the fuel lines, I blew them out. That doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't a little bit of sticky stuff left in that fuel line that could have possibly gotten by the filter. It's got a brand new filter in it. I will pull that filter, shake out any possible gunk, and see if there is anything in there. But I'll really look over this carburetor just in case there might have been something in these lines that I overlooked when I blew everything out and cleaned all these lines too. So it's good news. I'm not picking up any real noticeable crud in the bottom of the bowl. Does not appear that the needle and seat is sticking, so I'll keep inspecting it. There's a little bit of staining in the bottom, but it won't come off, so those stains are, I would say, permanent, other than maybe having to get out sandpaper or a scouring pad and really scuff it up, which I will do. I'll clean up all of this bowl as much as I can, and then I'll just go through and inspect all these pieces really close. So, as you can see, I've got all the parts on this carburetor all out, and I'm going through and checking tolerances and fit, and just making sure everything looks good. One of the things I neglected to check last time when I had this carburetor apart was the shaft for the main butterflies, to make sure there wasn't any wear. These are brass and they're coated with nickel, and if they have a lot of wear, you can see the brass where it's worn through on these pivot points, and this one is in excellent condition, so that's really good. Another thing that I just really wanted to make sure is all these little air valves, all these little bleed areas, make sure that none of those were plugged. Maybe something had gone through the old dirty lines or gotten past the filter, but everything, running a little pin, a little wire, and all those pinholes, and really checking everything over, it all looks fantastic. So far so good as I'm putting all this back together. I did have another carburetor kit, so I'm just making sure to double check all my gaskets for the fitment and make sure everything has got good clean tolerances and clean surfaces. It's looking really good so far. So this area right here is vacuum. It's at the base of the butterfly plate for the throttle plate. And you can see there's areas around it where it should seal off. And one of the things you have to be really careful of, and you can see with this gasket that's in place and the impression that it left. We want to make sure there's no areas where vacuum could leak or it could suck air through the edges. As you can see from the impression where this was mounted, there is a good solid seal. So there's no issues with vacuum at the base of this part, and the seal in between the body and the bottom plate has a really good seal too. There's no vacuum leaks in any of that area. Confident now that I've got all the issues out of this carburetor, the center carburetor. Well, like I said, I'll go ahead and pull these outer carburetors off, make sure I don't have any vacuum leaks. You can see there's a really good seal all around these butterflies. It's good contact on the bore. I need to make sure I've got the same thing on these other two carburetors. This was not aligned properly when I took it apart. This area here was rubbing too tight. There should be just a slight gap in there. It was putting a lot of pressure on this area, and that's what was making it wobble. Every time I tightened it up, the wobble would come back, and that was just due to the pressure on that base. So once I loosened up those butterfly screws, there's enough play so I could bring that shaft out, take the pressure off. There's just a slight gap there now. Everything's super tight. Feeling much, much better about this carburetor. So we can also see on this gasket that all the vacuum ports have good solid contact so that there's no vacuum leaks at this carburetor either. You can also see on this base the butterflies are solid and well closed all around both ports. So I don't have any air leak on this carburetor, but I do have some fuel leak. And I'll take this base off and I'll show you. There's a gasket in here. That gasket, according to the specs for the 59 carburetor, has some slight little vent holes just behind this piece. And those vent holes are what's allowing the fuel to come out around that base. And then it looks like I've got just a little bit of leakage that is probably coming from this fitting. So I will have to make sure to get that sealed up too. So these are the areas I was talking about where it's allowing fuel to flow out of these corners, as well as it's sucking air up through these passageways. Now the manual, the rebuild instructions showed to go ahead and use this gasket. Why, I just don't know. It doesn't make any sense. So I am going to replace this gasket with the one that makes sense. And there's a guy online who's got a speed shop. I did contact them and they said the same thing. Yeah, they've seen this before. It doesn't make sense, and to just go ahead and use the other gasket that closes those areas off. Now I just need to put a sealant around the edge of these threads. This came off about at that angle, so that feels very solid now. I don't think I'm going to have any issues with that leaking. So we definitely want to check all these connections before we start the car up. You know, just to be safe, I'm going to go ahead and pull the top off of this carburetor. I want to check the float and the needle and seat. There's no suspect at all that there's an issue there, but while we've got it apart, let's just take a quick look. The inside of the carburetor is very clean, so I'm pleased to know that I didn't pick up any residue from any of the plumbing leading to the carburetor. So I'm confident that I'm not picking up anything that's plugging any of these ports. For the secondary carburetors are these little squirters, so when this presses in, it'll squirt out of those two little ports. They recommend using like a linseed oil or a paint thinner to test it. So we can just fill that port up, run the pump, and watch these little squirters. Hopefully you can see this. You can see that little squirt. Both fangs are spraying. So no, there's nothing in those passageways. Now when it comes to the float drop, I do want to check the float while I have this apart. The old guy is quite an expert on these carburetors. He says to make sure that float doesn't drop any more than 3/4 of an inch. So according to the manual, for this particular carburetor on an outside for a tri-power, it's saying anywhere from 5/8 to 11/16. Well, the old guy says, just as a rule of thumb, set them all at 3/4. So this one looks like we're right about 9/16. So it's definitely a little bit off. Now we're just under 3/4. The manual says 5/8 to 11/16. It says a little above 11/16. I'm going to leave it right there. I think that's a good place to leave it. And now when it comes to the float drop, the float drop is 1 3/4. I'm at 1 5/8. 1 3/4 now. Now we'll double check. I'm still at 3/4, just a hair under. So I feel really good about this one now. Well, they recommend not tightening these screws down really tight. Just get them good and snug. Basically bottom out the lock washer and then turn it just a little bit more, because you can warp this top plate. It's not as common with the Rochesters, but other carburetors have a tendency to warp and then you get some leakage. So no reason to really over tighten those. There's no pressure inside of it. It's just a matter of sloshing while you drive, so it doesn't take a whole lot to seal it up. Okay, so this one's done, and I'll grab the other outer carburetor and we'll go through the same procedures. So again, we've got good solid connection all the way around the butterflies. Got good seal. I've got the vacuum ports that make sense. It goes around and seals off this area. I decided to mock up the linkage before all my parts get here, just to get a good idea of where it was as a 2-barrel like the gray car. As far as I could tell by all the measurements and the pivot points, I mocked up this little bracket. I made a metal piece, I bolted it on, and now I have good travel. When I pull it wide open, you can see the linkage where it stops against the base of the carburetor. So now I'm getting full movement. There's nothing that can bind up. There's still more room for the pedal arm to travel. So now that that is hitting the stop, it's also hitting the choke stop there. All the linkage looks good. I feel much better about this. This is just temporary. Crank it over a little bit, make sure there's no leaking fluid, and it looks like I do have some leaking fluids. Fix that. Check for leaking fuel. Okay. Everything looks good. I'm going to pour just a teeny bit of fuel in until the pump bleeds all the air out of the line. excellent. I'll adjust that idle up just a hair, and I'll probably have to open up my idle fuel mixtures just a hair as well. This is a good sign. Still doesn't have any fuel in it. Still no fuel. That pump was dripping here, so I know I'm pushing fuel. Now I've got fuel there. I have to take the top of that off. We'll see just what the story is inside of that. Well, it looks like my fuel pump seal had inverted. Probably should have put just a little bit of lubricant on it. It had dragged on the way down, and it had inverted that seal. Luckily it didn't damage it any. The bowl is half full. Well, let's try that again. Well, that was a confidence booster. I'll try adjusting this choke just a little bit more. I can see my breath out here now, so I know it's getting plenty cold. That choke should be closing. It's not. There we go. I don't know if that was hanging up. Free movement now. Let's try that again. One thing's for sure, I get the feeling this car just does not like to be choked. Every time this has had any problems at all, it has been when it gets cold enough that that choke starts to close. The cubic inch displacement of this engine with the 2-barrel carburetor, I think it just needs a lot of air. Let's try that. Now it just acts like it's getting too much fuel. I think it starts when that choke starts to close and it starts to suck in a lot of fuel, and then it floods out. I'm going to have to go back to the drawing board and really scrutinize this carburetors to see. Maybe I need to jet it down. We are at high altitude. Since we're in Salt Lake City, Utah, I'm at almost 5,000 feet. And up here on the hill, I think I'm probably even over 5,000 feet. So maybe it needs to be jetted down. starting to think that might be the issue. The old guy at the speed shop likes to just take the chokes right off and put on a mechanical choke. Yeah, I mean, he might be onto something. I'm going to disconnect the linkage between the two secondary carburetors just to see if maybe there's enough pull between the two on that rod that maybe it's opening up and allowing a little too much air into that secondary carburetor. Well, this is beyond my pay grade. It's about the only thing I can think of is the jets. It appears to be getting too much fuel, but I don't know that for sure. Well, I'm going to play around with the timing just a little bit. I know when we had it running so good, the timing was just exactly where the car liked it to be. But now it's acting like timing is off. I feel like I'm getting fuel now, but it's still not running right. Definitely acts like the timing had slipped. I had it tightened down good and tight. I didn't think there was any way it actually slipped, but it's sure looking like it. Wow, that was loud.
Yeah, it sounded like a gunshot.
You want to see something really crazy? Two brand new mufflers. Wow. And it was loud. I'll have to muffle it on the video. I have never in my life backfired like that. Obviously, those mufflers were full of fuel, or just enough fuel that it turned them into a bomb when it backfired. So now, way beyond just humble pie, I gotta buy some new mufflers. I got a lot of work to do now, and it still isn't running right. I still feel like it's getting too much fuel. So in the next episode, of course, after I get new mufflers on it, so I'm not blasting out the garage and the neighbors, I got to check the jets in this. I should have checked the jets while I was apart. They are numbered, but I didn't know what to look for. I didn't know if it had a number on it, what that number even meant. So I've got to do some research, find out what jets are best, where to start from, where to go up and down, altitude, cold temperatures. And then I definitely need to look at timing, dwell, all the points, all those parts, because it's acting like electrical as well. When it runs smooth. As you can see in this video, there's a couple of times it ran really, really smooth, but then it wouldn't idle. And as soon as I try to set the idle, then everything goes crazy again. Well, I think there's some electrical issues I've got to try. At least I'm going to have to go through all the electrical in it just to make sure. And then jets and timing, and then hopefully we can find this. Between me and my buddy Jim, I'm sure we will. Until the next episode, I appreciate you watching. Thanks for tuning in. Give me a like if you would, if you like what I'm doing. Subscribe if you haven't already. Really appreciate you watching. Thanks again. Bye for now.